Welcome back for what will be surely another wonderful day. Following the format that we used yesterday, each of the speakers will speak for 20 minutes. We'll hold all the questions until the end, and we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion with the panel. Also, unfortunately, one of the speakers, Helene Landemore, was not able to come today. So the speakers that we will have, first Henry Farrell will speak, then Karim Lakhani, and then Beth Novak. So I'd like to start by introducing Henry Farrell. He's a professor of political science at George Washington University. He is the author of the book, The Political Economy of Trust, and we had a wonderful conversation walking over here on the way to the conference, so I'm sure he's going to give a wonderful talk. Henry.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm not sure that the talk will be wonderful. If it manages to be adequate, I will be happy. But what I want to talk about, the title of my talk is the intelligence of democratic disagreement. And what I want to talk about is the mismatch between a lot of the ways in which we think about collective intelligence and the kinds of collective intelligence that are either demonstrated or not demonstrated in democratic politics. So, as we've seen in the panels of the conference over the last day and a half, there's a new conversation coming into being across a very wide variety of disciplines. I list a bunch of them here. One could easily have added several more. These disciplines have very different approaches, come from very different places, study very different topics, but all have a common interest in processes of collective problem solving. And over the last number of years, we've begun to see a rough intellectual convergence happening between these disciplines, between the ways that they think about collective problem solving. And this, like all such convergences, is allowing new and valuable conversations to take place on the basis of a set of broadly shared assumptions. So this is all good and wonderful. But what I want to argue is that some of the common assumptions that people usually make, and here I must admit, like everybody else here, I am a tourist in many of these areas. There may be huge swathes of work which I'm completely unfamiliar with, but from what I do see a set of common assumptions being shared across a large body of the work that we are doing on collective problem solving. And these seem like relatively anodyne assumptions. In many fields, they are anodyne assumptions, but I think they have consequences for the ways in which we may or may not apply processes of collective decision-making, collective intelligence, collective problem-solving to the kinds of problem-solving that happens in democratic politics. Firstly, and most basically, by and large, when we model this stuff, we have a basic sense that the actors who are doing this agree, to the extent that they are capable of agreeing, that there is a problem there to be solved. This obviously doesn't preclude various kinds of complexities. Actors may have different specifications of the problem. They almost certainly will have different understandings of where the solution can be found. They may have great difficulties in searching across a complex landscape for particular solutions or in figuring out whether a solution is an inferior local optimum or not. But nonetheless, they at least are going to agree that there is a problem. Secondly, and perhaps more trickily when it comes to human beings, much or most of this work assumes that there is no conflict of interest. That is, that actors, when they're engaged in collective problem solving, they look to the collective problem and they are in more or less universal agreement, or at least they could be in more or less universal agreement if they had access to the same information on what the best solution is. And this solution, the best solution for these actors, is the best solution for the collectivity, and actors are able to more or less subordinate their individual interests in the search for this common best solution. Finally, and this kind of goes together with the second assumption, we by and large don't pay attention to power relations. In this, we don't look at how actors may have privileged ability to shape problem-solving processes for reasons which are completely disconnected to their actual problem-solving abilities. We don't look at ways in which actors might have the opportunity to influence how problems are solved in ways that perhaps might be deleterious because they are looking to solve problems in ways that are useful to them rather than looking for the best overall collective solution. Now, these are very, very useful simplifying assumptions. And in some fields, they actually not only are useful simplifying assumptions, but they make a lot of sense. If we are thinking about problem solving in beehives, or termite mounds, or ant nests, or whatever, we can see that, first of all, there isn't going to be any debate or discussions among ants as to whether the trying to find food for the nest is going to be a problem. This is a problem that ants are, in a certain sense, they have behaviors which are optimized to solve. Similarly, there's going to be no great degree of conflict of interest among ants or other eusocial species. Almost by definition, under most circumstances, the individual unit will place the survival of the collective ahead of its individual benefit, and equally, for the same reasons, we don't need to pay very much attention to power relations. This, unfortunately, for better or for worse, is not true of human beings. Human beings, whether this be a good thing or a bad thing, are not ants or bees. And typically, when they try to solve problems, they solve problems through the political process, and the political process can sometimes get pretty ugly and contentious. This is a cartoon of a famous duel that took place on the floor of the Congress back in 1798, which began with the spitting of tobacco juice and culminated in a fight between two congressmen, one armed with fire tongs, another with his walking stick. Typically, politics doesn't get quite as problematic as this, but nonetheless, politics involves a lot of dispute, a lot of argumentation, and a lot of conflict of interest. What this means is that when we think about democratic processes, the ways that democratic politics typically take place violate all of these commonly held assumptions that we like to cling to when we think about collective intelligence. We cannot count on agreement that there is a problem among all of the actors. Global warming, I think, is a perfect example of that. There is a group of people within American politics who think that global warming is perhaps the most important threat to face the United States and the world. There is also a group of people in American politics who think that global warming not only is not a problem, but in fact is a liberal plot being foisted upon the unsuspecting American public in order to allow environmentalists and the United Nations to take over the world. Clearly, when you have this kind of disagreement, this makes for problems for actual problem solving if you cannot agree on what the problem is or whether there is a problem in the first place. Secondly, in politics, actors obviously disagree over solutions. They do not typically place the collective over the individual. Instead, different groups, different individual actors pursue their interests, pursue their different political philosophies, which may lend a separate set of complications. And this means that they may, even if they agree on what the solution space looks like, they may disagree violently over which is the best solution to offer. One actor or group of actors' preferred solutions may look like absolute disaster to another. And finally, in politics, we see an abundance of power relations. When we look at the actors who have greatest influence over the political process, we have no necessary warrant whatsoever to assume that these actors who have the greatest influence are the actors who are cognitively or otherwise best suited to solve the actual problems. And we have mountains of empirical evidence to demonstrate that this very often is emphatically not the case. So, how do we respond to this? Well, one response might be to define collective intelligence in ways that we more or less duck this set of issues. And this is, I think, a perfectly reasonable attitude to adopt. There are many, many ways in which we can apply the insights of collective intelligence to problems that are far less intractable than the problems of democratic politics. And I'm not even going to get into non-democratic problems of politics, which present a new set of difficulties altogether. And we can concentrate on problem-solving contexts where these difficulties abilities are either completely absent or are less marked. As I've already mentioned, we can talk about problem solving among eusocial insects, or we can talk about problem solving among robots. These obviously are not likely to involve the same kinds of conflicts of interest. Alternatively, we can also turn to aspects of human behavior where these problems are less marked. For example, Michael Nielsen wrote a wonderful book back a couple of years ago about problem solving in the scientific context and how it is being aided by new forms of communication. And he specifically argues here that the wonderful methods of collective problem solving that he is looking at do not work in the political realm because you get much starker disagreements of philosophy and conflict of interest, but they do work in the process of scientific discovery because scientists are bound by some sort of rough normative consensus. Another approach is to try and, I think, frankly, wave away the problem. And this is the solution that has been adopted by technocrats since at least the last century. Most recently, I think a wonderful example is Sergey Brin. After the last presidential elections, he complained about how horrid all of this partisanship was and said that what ought to happen was that the leaders of each of the parties ought to come together, abandon their parties, and just manage American politics in the best interest of America. This seems to me to be a hopelessly utopian vision, and also one which, which I think represents it's a very attractive and appealing vision, but that's not the way that politics works. Politics is as it is because people disagree very often fundamentally. The third approach that one can adopt is to try to build more realistic accounts of problems using some of the tools of collective intelligence and try to learn from them. So in other words, rather than taking these assumptions as given, interrogating them and thinking about what might work, how things might work when these assumptions do not actually apply. And this can actually point as well to some ways in which democratic politics have real substantial benefits. And here I'm leaning heavily on the work of two political theorists, Jack Knight and Jim Johnson, who argue that under democratic conditions, political argument between people who strongly disagree with each other have vital epistemological benefits. In other words, has vital benefits for the ways that we can construct our knowledge about how to deal with difficult issues and how to solve problems. Roughly, the insight here is that the intelligence of democracy is contained within its disagreements. If we have people who are arguing over interests, arguing over different visions of how politics might work, each of these visions, at least potentially, may contain crucial insights into how to solve these problems, and the processes through which these interests and these ideas clash may furthermore generate new insights. And under this perspective, the challenge for democracy is not to eliminate these forms of dispute and argument and contention. Instead, it's to harness them for useful purposes. And this is a huge problem, but this is nonetheless a problem which I think is the problem that we need to think about carefully if we actually want to engage properly with how the democratic process works. So, what are the challenges that this presents us with? First of all, we need, and this is the most difficult challenge, this is the challenge which frankly I have no answers for today, we need to think about how it is that common understandings of problems get constructed. That is, we need to think about the processes through which individual actors identify problems and at least sometimes come to agree on what a problem is in ways that allow them further to cooperate. Once we've done that, once we look at collective problems, we need to look at how processes of decision-making over how these problems are solved work. And in particular, we need to look at how actors with strongly clashing interests, strongly clashing understandings of what the problem is may come together, the circumstances under which they are able to reach some kind of limited agreement over this, and the ways in which their different interests, their different preferred solutions may shape the process, what kinds of positive or negative aspects that has. And finally, as part of this, we also want to think very carefully about how different power relations play into this, how some actors may have more influence than others over how the political process works. So what I'm going to put forward here is not anything that even approaches a general solution to this. It's one particular approach, and not only is it one particular approach, it's the beginnings of one particular approach. We do not have any robust results to report here. What I want to do instead is to talk about how analytical tools can, at least in principle, be applied to these problems and what kinds of ways we might want to model this. And here I'm resting on collaborative work with Cosma Szelizy, a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon and at the Santa Fe Institute. And I should stress that in what is to come, anything that seems even faintly mathematically sophisticated is entirely Cosma's insight rather than mine. So how do we want to go about this? Well, what we suggest is that one way you might go about this is by using agent-based modeling, albeit with a couple of twists. And some of this is pretty standard setup. So we argue we want to think about agents as confronting a repeated problem where they have to agree on a single one-dimensional action. And the optimal action, the action that they're trying to look for, is a linear function of a high-dimensional vector, a vector with about 100 dimensions. And the various coefficients of this vector, most of them are small. A few of them are going to be quite large. Agents learn, they do not learn linear models. Instead, they learn decision trees using the CART algorithm. They have access to relatively few predictor variables. They have each of them has a sample of predictor variables. They also have a relatively small number of training cases, which will never exceed the number of coefficients, meaning that so they're never going to create, individual agents are going to have more or less no chance of creating any kind of reasonably accurate representation of the overall problem. So this is trying to figure out how agents respond to really tough problems. So first, into this, we can introduce some degree of diversity of goals. And we do this by having two classes of agents, who we dub elites and non-elites. We are not unique in the way that we think about the cognitive capacities of these agents. We give the elite actors some degree of edge. They have access to a greater level of cognitive abilities or processing or whatever than do non-elites. And we model this by giving the elites access to a larger sample of the predictor variable than we do non-elites. But what we do, which is somewhat different, is we somewhat crudely model the way in which these elites and non-elites will have somewhat different, albeit related possibly, optimal action rules. In other words, the elites and the non-elites will be looking for different solutions to the overall problem, and we have the optimal action rules are two coefficient vectors, which are drawn from the same distribution, and what this allows us to do is to manipulate the extent to which there is commonality of interest or lack of commonality of interest between the elites and non-elites. We can look at cases in which the elites and the non-elites more or less have identical or convergent interests, situations in which their interests partly converge, situations in which their interests are independent from each other, and situations in which their interests are actually to some greater or lesser degree opposed to each other. This is pretty crude, but nonetheless, it allows us to get at this useful fact that individuals are going to have diverse goals, and that these goals may sometimes be partly collaborative, sometimes not so collaborative, and to manipulate the degree to which this is going to be so. Furthermore, we introduce social structure and power. Actors in these simulations that we're starting to create, they're situated in a social network with a variety of clustered communities, and this has consequences for the ways in which they try to solve the problems. During the training cases, individual agents can be chosen at random to compare their ability to solve the problem with other agents who are located co-adjacent on the network. If one agent seems to be doing better than another, then the agent which is doing less well can swap in a variable, one of the variables from the agent who is doing better, and this can be iterated a number of times, and we can control this. So this also allows us to think about power and influence in a certain kind of way. Because if we set this up so that non-elites are likely to preferentially attach themselves to elites, this then allows us to look at networks in which elite actors are more likely to become the crucial bridging nodes between different clusters, and hence to have a greater role in influencing which kinds of solutions to the problems get passed on and which kinds of solutions do not. And this provides us with a kind of, again, a simple and relatively crude way of incorporating power considerations into our account. In future work, we not only want to look at how it is that the interests of elites and non-elites may differ from each other, but also how the interests of different communities within this broad network may differ from each other, and see how that affects collective problem solving too. So where does this get us? Well, what it does in a certain sense is to give us a very crude, very simple way of thinking about how democratic politics works. Because if you think about different political parties and sort of contending with each other in a realm of partisan competition, you can think about these clusters, these communities within the network as bearing some resemblance to the ways that parties work. We model these clusters as having, to some degree, shared subsets of the variables, sort of representing different ways, different approaches to how to tackle the problem. To the extent that these also have different interests, this helps to model the way in which interests and differences of interests and differences in understanding of the problem tend to coincide in democratic politics and give us something which is roughly and crudely analogous to the ways that parties jostle with each other, but also learn from each other as they try to figure out how to solve problems. We also have, obviously, some way of thinking about how different relationships between elites and non-elites, between the key actors who lead in politics and the actors who do not, how this may also have consequences for the way that problem solving works. And so what this suggests, I think, is a way that we can begin to think about a somewhat better account of politics and of collective problem solving as involving problem solving among actors who not only are imperfect in their understanding of the problem, but also who have different interests about how the problem ought to be solved and different ability to shape the process through which the problem is solved. And this potentially provides us with a set of tools that we can use to think better about democratic politics. I hasten to make absolutely clear this is just one way that you might seek to model these things, but I do think that if we want to think about democratic politics and about the fundamental problems of collective intelligence that face our society in the United States and other societies around the world today, we are going to have to come to grips with these problems, and this at least is one way in which we can start to try to do that. Thank you very much.